The alien syllables were weak and faint. Luke looked down at the gurney which held the body of the broken, limbless Jawa. The medical servitor has placed an IV in your circulatory system. You do not need water, he repeated. The Jawa's eyes fluttered between hyper-awareness, panic, fight, or flight, and slipping into shock, glazing over. The pain is in your mind. This is your first lesson. A Jedi's mind is one with the Force, and a Jedi controls the Force. Luke walked next to the gurney, hovering soundlessly. He was accompanied by only 2 medical surveyors. The courts had granted him patriarchy of the old Jedi Order and temporary custodianship of the temple. But the case was still contended. The Jedi Order had possessed great wealth and influence under the Republic, even rivaling the Republic's influence. They had owned 1 billion temples on as many worlds. Now it was shattered, scattered, seized and redistributed under the Imperial rule. Jedi factions were scattered around the galaxy, small, broken, weak, fighting amongst themselves over ancient theological disputes and new prophecies. Most had been purged, and it was only crackpots and fringe elements who had survived on the Rim, or not important enough to bring down Imperial wrath. In the cavernous Jedi temple on Coruscant, it felt empty now. The giant complex had once been a bustling city in itself. Luke had never seen it, but had reviewed the hollows and grown to dislike the decadence and pomp. He hardly recognized the Grandmaster Yoda in those old days, at the height of his power, surrounded by subaltern and ceremony. Luke was slowly rebuilding, but he kept the temple cold, austere. There were only a few thousand acolytes now, selected by himself, and they left the complex feeling empty. He preferred it this way. He was guiding the servitors down to the chambers prepared for his new apprentice. The only sound in the temple was his echoing bootsteps against the ancient stones and the small, painful sounds of the Jawa. "Ah, Koti! Ani Akoti!" The Jawa shivered and moaned. "You are not cold. Tatooine was hot. This is your second lesson." "There's a genocide going on Hati," Admiral Solo observed dryly, "and Kashyyyk, and half the Outer Rim planets." "You have your orders, Admiral," the Queen Leia observed just as dryly. "We can't afford to send the new Republic's fleet out on a cruise of the Outer Rim. You will prioritize Coruscant and then the key worlds of the inner orbit." Solo was not happy. He tugged at the collar of his uniform. Leia looked down the briefing table at her admiral and former lover. Were they still lovers? She wasn't sure anymore. Han wasn't the sort of man with a long attention span, and she had ignored him for quite some time now. He was a criminal, had grown up amongst criminals. All his friends and acquaintances had been criminals. But he was also one of her only reliable allies. The seat next to Han, where Chewbacca should be, was empty. This was worrying, especially with the violence escalating on Kashyyyk. The rest of her council would wonder if Chewie was tied to that, subverting the efforts for peace, feeding information to the nationalist Wookiee factions trying to drive human settlers off their planet. Leia was annoyed with Han. He was just being contrarian, wanting to break free. He didn't really have a plan to stop the violence on Hati or Kashyyyk. He just wanted to fly his big fleet around. And they'd barely been able to contain the violence in the Inner Rim. The Republic had always been an unstable, multi-species compromise, dominated by humans. The Imperial era had seen human domination cast off the mask of compromise for a short time. Now the mask was back on. They called Leia Empress, and the rebel, now neo-Republican fleet had been dominated by mostly human officers. The Senate was overwhelmingly dominated by non-human planetary representatives, while humans being a numerous minority in most corners of the galaxy after several centuries of expansion and colonization since the Mandalorian and Clone Wars dominated the representative body. Leia held a tenuous grasp on power. The destruction of the Death Star and the large Imperial fleet which had ensured peace in the galaxy had left a huge vacuum in power. Leia now filled it with compromise, clever alliances, and shrewd diplomacy. As well as Han's Republican fleet, which was still considerable, and which the Senate at every turn attempted to appoint a new admiral to. Luke had been raised a moisture farmer and had turned to religion recently, trying to rebuild an ideal order that Leia knew had never existed. Han chafed under authority. He was prone to disregard orders from the Senate and courts, and even her, just for the sake of rebelling. He'd never been an ideological convert to the rebellion, and both former rebels and nationalist interests mistrusted him. He was probably involved in corruption. He had been a smuggler before. But both Luke and Han had no previous connections in the court or Senate. They had no homeworld or other families and networks. This made them relatively neutral, difficult for other nationalist and self-interested factions to approach, and still loyal to Leia's project, to rebuild some pre-imperial order. Prejudice is predictable, Chewbacca thought. Han had been better at seeing through it when he was younger. Responsibilities had clouded his judgment. He'd allowed himself to be caged by his own authority. He was under scrutiny constantly when he was used to the anonymity of a smuggler's life. Chewbacca had fared better. He'd let the human prejudice work against itself. The Xeno was ignored, and all attention was on the human. He and Han had always been equal partners, but it was always assumed the human was in command. They'd used this sometimes to their advantage when they'd been young, smuggling a few tons of contraband between the stars. Now, in the chaos that followed the collapse of the Empire, Chewbacca had built up an empire. It was inevitable. He had connections across the galaxy and influence. He could manipulate the shipping routes, security, tariff, and tax collectors. He estimated he controlled 18% of all galactic shipping now through shell corporations he'd set up and partnerships. The Republic was a cripple, unable to supply its own fleet and unable to protect shipping routes. Leia was a politician. She didn't understand the complex commerce between systems. Chewbacca understood it intimately. He kept the wheels on the fleet running and oversaw logistics. Han knew most of it, but not all. Chewbacca had an intelligence network that spanned the galaxy. He knew what the fugitive Imperial Admiral of the 413th Fleet had for breakfast this morning. He knew how many heavy weapons were on Kashyyyk, and knew that the Hutt nationalists were only pretending to have heavy weapons. He'd become invaluable to the fleet of the Republic and to post-Imperial commerce. Leia seemed unaware. The rest of the counselors and Senate were fickle politicians. Chewbacca knew how to play the meek subaltern to the human interests. Most Xenos assumed he would have sympathy with their nationalist sentiments. But Chewbacca was a pragmatist, still a smuggler and a dealmaker at heart. It was only Luke, the old wizard, that worried him. He had felt Luke in his mind at times, looking around, browsing his secrets. But Luke did and said nothing, and that worried Chewbacca more than the rest of the politicians, spies, and military officers who never shut up about their agendas. Luke's agenda remained hidden to most people.
A revolution always eats its own.
Jedi Master Beretor Lo Argath of the First Republic. Prior to the Mandalorian Wars, humans were a small minority spread across the galaxy without a homeworld. They were fractured and lacked any political cohesion. The Mandalorian Empire was a diverse multi-species state, one of several large factions which dominated the galaxy at that time. The Jedi Order was still reeling from its own internal wars and infighting. The Orthodox Jedi theology was solidifying and consolidating power. The Sith were invented at this time. Those heretics the Orthodox Order deemed dangerous. Humans on many worlds struggled to integrate. They bred rapidly. Their cultures were incommensurable with local customs. They were seen as aggressive and backwards. The pogroms at this time on many Mandalorian worlds were not official policy, but they were seen as being allowed to spread by the Mandalore. It was this perceived persecution that united many human factions into a political force. They were crushed repeatedly for a century, but then reached some critical mass and began to grow beyond the control of the Mandalorians. The humans formed alliances with other minority groups. After the multi-species religion of the Jedi Order, barely tolerated for its infighting and political aspirations in the Mandalorian Order, joined with the human interests, it became intolerable to the Mandalorians and full-scale war broke out across the galaxy. This was a dark age, which gave birth to a limited human ascendancy. It was during the Mandalorian Wars that humans first began to employ cloning on a wide scale to shift the demographics of many planets and mobilize populations that could be seen as more reliable than many of the multi-species alliances which ruled the galaxy. Demographic engineering through cloning or other means was outlawed in the post-war order, but was seen as consistently violated by humans on many worlds. The Clone Wars followed. The First Republic emerged from the compromises reached in the Clone Wars. The Jedi Order reached the zenith of its power as a multi-species religious court and mediator between worlds. The Republic and many worlds were dominated by human interests, but in the Senate, humans would always, necessarily, remain a minority. The ascendancy of the dictator Palpatine had ended the uneasy compromise of the Republic. He had disregarded the resolutions of the Senate for years, building large fleets of homogeneous and reliably loyal human crews, with a vast cloned army of shock troops, the stormtroopers, for assaulting and occupying dissident planets. The threat of the Death Star had created true stability and peace in the galaxy for the first time in centuries. But his authoritarian rule had alienated many human factions as well as non-human ones which united to form the Rebel Alliance. The xenophobia and fascism of the policies alienated the Jedi Order, which he purged of elements seen as not loyal. Without the backing of the Senate and Jedi Order, the rebellion spread and many turned to the Rebel Alliance out of necessity. The loss of the Death Star was the nail in the coffin of the Imperial project and ended their dominion between the stars. The new Republic, emerging from the Rebel Alliance, is a shadow of old Republican power. Across many worlds, the pendulum has swung back the other way now, with human settlers, colonizers, and clones being purged. The Rebel Alliance losing its common threat, the Imperial fleet, is shattered.
Once the seed of an empire is planted, it is either growing or rotting.
Darth Sidious of Dantooine. Darth used to just be another synonym for saint or wise man. In Gallic, it was a generic religious title. Darth Athanas was an old, bitter academic. He looked at the lightsaber hanging from the young Jedi's belt with distaste. Such weapons were not allowed within his monastery, but this young Jedi, claiming to be from the New Order, would not be parted with it. He wore the weapon like a badge, something to be proud of. Athanas could read the young man's sanctimonious arrogance. He thought of Athanas as a Sith, heretic. Athanas considered the young human's faith in the Force to be weak if he felt naked without a saber. The way he addressed Athanas made it obvious that he considered the title of Darth to be some sort of dirty word. The hypocrisy from a Jedi who aspired to be called Master. How could a Jedi be called Master? What can someone who has taken a vow of asceticism be a master over? Darth Athanas had spent the last century on an isolated moon, in study and mediation while the wars raged around the galaxy. He took only a few Padawan in that time, almost as old as he himself was. They watched the outsider warily. It had been years since a human or agent of the Republic or Empire had set foot on this moon. Athanas crossed his tentacles now and tried to read the path through the Force that had brought this young Jedi from the New Order here. He only saw Skywalker, the one who portrayed himself as some kind of messianic figure now, preaching about balance in the Force. All else was obscured, and Athanas could see no further. They offered the young Jedi refreshments in one of the gardens domed by clear plascrete, open to the starry sky above. The young human wore a thin environmental suit under his new Jedi robes. They still bore the emblem of the Rebel Alliance. Athanas thought this absurd as well. There was no alliance any longer. They had started fighting amongst themselves even before the Emperor was dead. The young Jedi waited for Darth Athanas' answer, or compliance. It had not really been a question, Athanas realized. It was a summons. He'd been able to hide in obscurity for so long. Now it seemed that would be shattered. The young Jedi was polite, but he'd come in a Corvette with a complement of Marines. Those re-educated human clones that had been stormtroopers and clutch of Republican commandos who still looked like rebels or mercenaries. Athanas had not seen them, but felt them as soon as they landed. This was a summons to Coruscant by the new Grandmaster Skywalker. He needed a new archivist. Athanas and his acolytes understood mysteries of the Force few others were aware of, but they did not train with the saber. He signed, resigning himself to his fate. The gravity of Coruscant would be crushing, with that caustic atmosphere that humans preferred. He'd spend most of his time in an exoskeleton, with a respiratory machine strapped to his gills. After a moment's pause, where the young Jedi attempted to read his thoughts and feelings and Athanas repulsed him, he tapped a few orders into his holopad.
I'd be honored to accept the invitation of the Grandmaster Skywalker. Give me a few days to make the arrangements for my departure. This old monastery doesn't just run itself.
Thrahui, Kandraki exclaimed as they made their approach in the Enola. The strip of pink flesh, shaved up from the leg to the Wookiee's torso, had just about disappeared under a mat of new fur. The Wookiee brought the Enola in on a landing approach above one of Coruscant's numerous slum districts. The whole planet below looked like a dark gray cancerous growth in space. A multitude of little lights fluttered about, little ships and stations, giant complexes full of alien atmospheres with artificially generated gravity. It was a hive world.
You're right about that.
The stripper sighed to the Wookiee. She'd been depressed since their escape from Tatooine. The many abuses and beatings during enslavement had left her hollowed out. She no longer recognized herself. She had done things to people she'd never imagined. Betrayals, murders. Tatooine had been a hell. But now that she was free, now that the Hutt was dead, there were no clients to please. There were no beatings or chains, physical or symbolic. Now that she had a friend beside her and the deck of a ship under her feet, a blaster and a lightsaber hanging from her belt, able to fly anywhere in the galaxy, she felt hollow, trapped, pursued, and she couldn't tell why. Dreams of the future haunted her. She saw the face of the stormtrooper she'd left to die in the desert. Not just any cloned trooper's face, but his. She felt he was not dead. She saw the Grandmaster Skywalker, watching her as she slept. She felt 1,000 echoes in the Force magnify her guilt and self-hatred.
Yeah, Candrake,
she repeated.
You're right about that.
They flew in low over the tops of the megastructures and gray wastes of slums, the giant concrete stretches of spaceports and billowing plumes of vapor from industrial sectors, inhabited only by enslaved semi-conscious droids.
What am I, knock pit? A carking poodoo hole? How are we ever going to find them here? If they are here.
Violence is a wheel. There is no top and bottom. It just keeps turning and crushing all who ride it and everything in its path.
Darth Athanas the Elder.
Green walked around the horrors of Korriban.
Some random Imperial assassin had recruited him. He was muscle now for the one called Mara Jade, some perverse and rebellious woman with a seemingly endless supply of New Republic credits. Now, how he got off Tatooine is another story. Needless to say, he was repaired with bionic parts. They were hunting a certain holocron on the ancient cursed planet of Korriban. It was uninhabitable to most, possessed by ancient demons, the worst kind. Most went into the old tombs and either lost their minds or were killed, not to mention multiple thought bombs had exploded on Korriban, rendering it spiritually altered and corrupt. Even someone as strong as Grandmaster Luke couldn't enter many ancient Sith tombs without extreme preparedness. Nonetheless, Green led a pack of jet troopers following one of the Empire's most lethal assassins, looking for a holocron originally created by Darth Sidious of Dantooine. The Jade's fire was left parked on Mount Khan, a relatively visible location and safest from tomb raiders and grave robbers. But now they were down in the valley of the ancient Sith. Mara Jade carefully approached the entrance to the tomb. Green held his blaster at the ready, his bionic fingers feeling the trigger. The other mercenaries, bastards with experience fighting rebels, many of them former stormtroopers, followed Green. Mara Jade called, pointing with Imperial tactical finger gestures. "Spread out! Cover me! Follow up quick!" 2 fingers to the left, 3 to the right, and Green spread out taking point, saving his jetpack fuel for emergencies. Mara walked into the tomb entrance, over the fallen pillars. Green's men could be heard quietly, forming a protective perimeter around the assassin Mara Jade. On the radio, Green called, "Enable the neural stabilizers, thought bomb force radiation, detected in strong doses." One of the soldiers fell into a seizure. Green almost panicked, but he'd seen the dark side before. Green hit the key with only a moment's hesitation, exploding a small detonator in the former stormtrooper's chest, killing him instantly. "Criffon hell," Green whispered. "Hold it together, men. This is only a taste of the dark forces that might await us." Mara Jade called back.
Tomb Raider droids detected. Proceed with caution.
Green had lost track of Jade. She was up ahead way too far in the Sith tomb. The whole scenario quickly becoming a horror hollow. Green could see Jade on his visor, though, for now. "Keep up, men. Don't fall behind," Green called. Leia had left her 3 kids to be raised by the new Jedi Order after Han had run off again. Jason, his twin Jaina, and the youngest Anakin would be raised from a young age in the ways of the Force. Not as orphans, though, but rather as nephews and niece of the Grandmaster himself, with every privilege that came with it. Though Luke forbid them from any special privileges to stand out from the other Padawans, it was inevitable. Senators buying them gifts, including a state-of-the-art astromech droid named Nufi for Jason. Jaina was given little dresses and droid dolls, while Anakin, the youngest, had an entire room filled with new Republic action figures and toy spaceships and stuffed tauntauns. Luke eyed Jason. "Control your anger, Padawan, for it leads to the dark side." Jason Force grabbed the new Marksman Cade training droid from Jaina and ran off insulting Jaina.
Know-it-all, Criffon Poodoo!
Jaina stood there and shrugged her shoulders.
Uncle Luke, he uses up all the marksman droids before I even get a chance.
Luke replied in a distant way. "There is no passion. There is serenity." Failing to punish Jason, Luke simply consoled Jaina in a bland way. "Just use 2 or 3 of the older Marksman H models, my little one. That should be more than enough to test your skills." The little girl shook her head.
The hardware's falling apart on those older models, and they don't interface well with the new data pads.
Meanwhile, little Anakin was climbing near an edge of one of the bridges inside the Jedi Temple Garden. Anakin started to fall, and Luke had to force catch him. "Stang! Jaina! You should be practicing. Go to the Jedi Knight Kyle Katarn. I've ordered him to spend some time this week training you and Jason." Luke was clearly frustrated. "In the meantime, I have to keep a sharp eye on your little brother Anakin." C-3PO appeared, making Luke jump.
Hello, I think.
His mind being elsewhere, across the galaxy, stealing secrets from the Force essence of Chewbacca. Luke gripped his black gloves in stress. "What is it, C-3PO? Shouldn't you be with Leia?" Luke calmed himself, tempted at times to force toss the protocol droid. C-3PO replied in his clueless way.
Leia left before I could board her vessel. There is a certain Darth Athanas here to see you.
This is madness.
Luke's hand instinctively fell to his lightsaber, and he had to take a deep breath. remembering it was the final step in a Padawan's trials to become a knight, retrieving Darth Sidious, that is. Luke threw on his black robe and told C-3PO, summon Kyle Katarn too, just in case this turns ugly. The woman and the Wookiee stepped out from the Enola a few levels down in the stench of an Imperial elastic rubber factory that was never officially shut down, still operated by the same humans placed in charge by the Empire, still receiving their credits from the same bank. The smell was overflowing and filled the nostrils with agony. Kandrak and the prostitute quickly put on their ventilation masks, and the door to the Enola geared close. Kandrake made a loud Wookiee noise, unafraid of being heard. The noise of the passenger speeders and factory clanking was nearly deafening. Kandrake blew the bolts off a heavy roof door and threw it away, making the heavy door seem light. The prostitute watches the door smash to the roof 10 feet away, reminding her of Kandrake's immense strength. The two snuck into the Imperial factory, a gray zone for New Republic rule of law. Robbing these imps was the perfect plan. Coruscant's security would be slow coming to the aid of an old Imperial elastics factory. Kandrake smashed a floor manager over the head with a blaster. They plugged into the computer, hacking into the system, hoping to find the secure tokens that could be anonymously redeemed for New Republic credits in the guise of monthly pay. These workers would be out of a job and the factory shut down, but Kandrake and the prostitute could care less. It was a galaxy with 1 trillion souls. Other work could be found on other planets. Kandrake yelled in Wookiee. The prostitute looked at the loading screen, downloading the secure tokens. She smirked.
Criffin imps. Not much better than the Hutts.
Meanwhile, Luke eyed Darth Sidious with Kyle Katarn close by. I hear you have the skills necessary to rebuild the Jedi Archive. Would you be interested? You would have to renounce allegiance to the dark side and teachings of the Sith, and renounce your Darth title in place of Jedi Archivist. But I'm told you are a philosopher of all the Force and seek no allegiance beyond knowledge. Darth Sidious replied in a cold, squid-like way, pacing around the Coruscant Temple sanctuary.
Jedi Archivist Athanos. It sounds respectable. I don't know that my acolytes would want to leave our remote moon. The Force does not feel full here, like a half-moon. We could move the archives to the isolated moon. My temple there has room enough to contain the new Jedi Archive.
Luke circled the philosopher and theologian Athanos in the Jedi sanctuary on Coruscant. Your temple is being shut down, Darth Athanos, and being cleansed to be converted into a holy Jedi temple if the Force cleansing is successful. Darth Athanos was suddenly angry and treated Luke like one of his students.
You know little of the Force, Grandmaster. I have been studying the wills and midichlorians for centuries, and you but a few decades without proper teaching. My home, my holy place, would be ruined if converted into a so-called Jedi temple. This cannot be done.
Luke raised his eyebrows in lack of amusement. It's being cleansed as we speak. Your acolytes will be freed if you comply. They may be able to join you in the archives given a few years in Jedi Archivist and Padawan training. This was all too much for Athanos.
And what do your people know of the ancient Sith and Jedi archives, or the ancient ways of the Force? I have kept secrets for hundreds of years. Powerful knowledge.
Luke sat on one of the tree benches. Your sanctioned work is being saved and delivered to Coruscant with the utmost care. Athanos refused to sit, quickly testing the force powers of those in the room, nearly an imperceptible pry. Kyle Katarn didn't notice, but Luke did. Athanos complained.
Sanctioned work. But there is value to all work studying the Force, even the dark side. But it is not evil, merely a different point of view. And besides, I am a pacifist. Neutral in mind and behavior, I do not take sides in petty conflicts. I am a being of learning. I shall only agree to Jedi Archivist if all my learnings are saved. All the scrolls and books, holocrons and data pads. I won't settle for half. What precious knowledge may be lost.
The Yujan Vong were crafty, demonic, biologically enhanced humanoids. Scouting parties were sent to gather intel on the primitive galaxy, always at war among its own stars. Flying in ships cloaked as asteroids, one small meteorite smashed into Korriban, shooting a mist of fine sand into the red sky. It was a drop pod carrying 2 Yujan Vong of an elite military nature. They wore their skin suits with pride as they snuck through the Sith desert wastes like Jawas in hiding. They spotted the Jade's fire on Mount Khan with their ultra-advanced Vong scanning tech. What they did not foresee on the unwholesome planet was a millennia of dark side forcecraft and Sith evil awaiting them. The Vong thought to steal the ship, but would kill its crew first and spy out the temples and caverns of the mysterious land. "Where's the fleet, Oros?" Chewbacca moaned. Oros struggled frantically against the restraints tying him to the chair. Oros spat back in Rodian.
What are you going to do? Rip my arms off?
Chewie roared, backhanding the Rodian to the ground. "You racist piece of bantha poodoo! You think just because I'm a Wookiee, I rip people's arms off?" The backhand nearly snapped the Rodian's neck. Oros lay sideways, still tied to the chair, gasping for breath. Han would offhandedly make racist remarks about Wookiee and every other species they came across back in their smuggling days. Back then, Chewie hardly noticed. When other Wookiees were around, they'd often privately ask Chewbacca why he hung out with a racist ass. Chewie always claimed Han wasn't racist. That's just how some humans talked. They didn't know any better. This often ended in a snarling argument about racism followed by some eye-rolling from Chewbacca before some quip about how the other Wookiees needed to pull the stick out of their poodoo holes. Chewie growled in a low rumble. "I sent you on a run with 6 fully crewed freighters. The whole fleet drops off the galactic map without a trace. And months later, one of my informants finds you drinking blue milk in a bar in Hutt space. How the criffing cark did you end up halfway across the galaxy? And where's my cargo?" Chewie started to notice the racism after the fall of the Empire. He thought things would get better once the Republic was back in power. He knew it would take time, but the reality was entirely different. The Republic just picked up where the Empire left off. The enslaved Wookiees and indentured servants spread across the galaxy by the Empire were no better off under Republic rule. The Republic always prioritized human and core interests over the rest of the galaxy. Han was making excuses. Sometimes he claimed it was Leia's fault for holding back. Other times he blamed it on the Senate or a lack of recourses. The reality, as Chewie saw it, was that Han was the admiral of a war fleet, and he sat on his hands waiting for everyone else to pull his strings. Chewie wondered if Han was just a human-first nationalist like the rest. The racism started to sting like a kinrath when the Republic continued imperial logging and mining policies on Kashyyyk, or when Wookiees were left in slavery across the galaxy, or when Wookiees were accused of war crimes for protecting their Force-given homeworld from the off-worlders trying to ravage the planet. The Rodian's knee snapped under Chewbacca's heel. Oros screamed, his whole body convulsed in agony. Chewie absent-mindedly turned and walked out of the room. Kel, a patchy, multicolored Twi'lek, was standing there outside the door. Did he talk? Chewie just shrugged. Kel gestured to the Imperial interrogation droid. He finally had gotten up and running. Do you want me to give it a spin? Chewie nodded, too tired for words. He was halfway down the hall when the Rodian screaming started. Chewbacca's legs gave out beneath him. He dropped to the floor and pulled his knees into his chest. There was no one else aboard other than Oros Kel, and Kel would be occupied for a while. Chewie slowly sunk into the dark pit in his soul. He just wanted it to stop, and he was the worst offender of all. These episodes usually lasted a few hours, followed by irresponsible levels of spice consumption, even for a Wookiee. Kel and a handful of others knew about Chewbacca's issue. Luke must have known too. But those who witnessed the periodic meltdowns knew better than to bring it up, and Luke probably didn't care. Chewbacca slowly extended his claws and started scratching into his wrists and arms. "Make it stop! Make it stop! Make it stop!" he mumbled repeatedly as images from his past and the hopelessness of the future flashed through his mind. Elix and her grandson Tetrax, two Mandalorians of tribe Tesolichi, sat on the wing of their ship watching the go-by. It started as a lesson on spacewalking on a vessel in motion, something every child was expected to master by the age of 10. But, as with most of Lix's lessons, it soon devolved into a discussion on tribal history. "Grandson," her quivering voice came over the tiny helmet comms. There was no sweetness there, only steel and Beskar. Tetrax knew feelings of love and vulnerability were fickle and fleeting. There are more profound, more reliable feeling that fills the heart with fire and slides a rod of cold Beskar down the spine. Emotions like awe, honor, and duty. These are the feeling Lix's voice inspired in Tetrax. These are the feeling felt in battle, or while sitting out on the wing of your own ship, made by your own hands, cutting across the void of space with abandon. He had heard it all 1,000 times before, but he still would have burned a world to ash just to listen to it all from his grandmother one more time. "Yes, honorable grandmother." Tetrax intended the term honorable as a playful jab. In their native tongue, honorable could mean either exhibiting horror or someone very old. His grandmother was in her early 60s, which was not quite yet considered old in their tribe. Tetrax saw he struck the mark just shy of endearment by the tilt of her helm, which would be the equivalent of a raised eyebrow of warning in most cultures. "Fine, you cheeky little womprat. You call out the names of the gods and tell me of each in turn. And if you hesitate, I'll kick you into the void, and we'll see just how fast your reflexes have become and how well you've been oiling and maintaining your Mag Cabal. And don't think I won't leave you in the void for a few days if you fail." As much as she tried to hide it, Tetrax could still hear her surprised smile over the comms. Tetrax failed to hide his own smile of awe over their comms. Well, first, there is Arasuum. He brings stability to the home and to the tribe. But if Arasuum was the only god, we would all fall into the evil of stagnation. Life would be easier, and the tribe would be safer, but our children would never grow, and our warriors would wither until the whole tribe blew away in the solar winds. And then next, there is Kad Harangir. He is the god of war, change, and growth. He taught our first warriors to fight and conquer, and we continue to do so to this day in honor and worship of him. But if he were the only god, there would be no tribe. We would be scattered to the solar winds until we were no more. The perpetual war in the stars beyond the galaxy between these two gods creates balance. And lastly, there is Hod Haran, the trickster god of wealth and shrewd tactics. He participates in the cosmic war, but he comes and goes. He neither wins nor loses. He fights simply for his own gain. If he were the only god, we'd all be rich. But we also like all soon be dead. And what of the tribes? Lix smirked with pride. Tetrax didn't hesitate for a second. The tribes are forgotten by the clans and the houses. The houses and their clans abandon the gods. They worship war and have thus descended into barbarism like the rest of the galaxy, except for Satine Kryze and her people. But they were boring pacifists and atheists who believed in nothing. The tribes worship the three gods. We are nomadic and live amongst the stars. We never allow our tribes to grow too large, splitting the tribes into smaller tribes as needed. We go about in the guise of rogue traders and mercenaries, hiding our nature and identity from those outside the tribes. We wear the armor of our earliest forefathers, lest we become dependent on the Beskar our cousins have fallen into fixation over. Our armor is strong like that of our cousins, but it promotes individuality as it's uniquely grown by its owner, unlike the Stormer Trooper armor, which had no purpose other than to strip away the self. Our people are more numerous than any would expect. We are all well armed and outfitted, not a poor tribesman amongst the tribes for over 1,000 years. Each of us is the product of careful breeding for thousands of years. Our most precious holy texts are our personal books of lineage, where our genetic traits are meticulously recorded, and the line of begots is kept for thousands of generations. Each is written in the hand of its bearer and subject matter. Each entered into the tribe computers and shared amongst the tribes. Math and science are performed by the elders. In doing so, they calculate the best genetic pairings. Our second holiest text is our books of story. Each tribesman keeps and writes every detail in the most honest and perfect fact possible of their own doings. These too are entered into the computers and shared amongst the tribes. Much is lacking from your explanation, Tetrax, but it's good enough for an 8-year-old. Come, let us go in and prepare for battle. We will meet up with the others soon. To what end, grandmother? A raid, my grandson. There are Imperial remnants in the sector. We'll pillage them. Tetrax, this may be the day you claim your first kill. May your awe fill you with fire, but may it be tempered by duty. Let it be so, grandmother. Let it be so. Chewie, wake up! Han is looking for you! Chewie! The Wookiee moaned and rolled over. A syringe popped and crunched under his weight. The room was littered with empty food and drink containers. Juices from who knows what were splattered across the floor and walls. The smell was unbearable. A pile of something in one corner smelt suspiciously like Wookiee poodoo. Chewie's fur was matted and gross, tangled and crusted into knots. Bald patches and lacerations up and down his arms. Like some majestic jungle creature slowly dying in captivity, abused and left to wallow in its feces in a cage too small. Chewbacca's head pounded. He roared and lashed out at Kel. Kel, though, was ready. This wasn't his first rodeo. He had stayed in the doorway just out of the Wookiee's reach. Come on, Chewie. You don't want Han to see you like this. Chewie let out a Wookiee sound of pain and tried to stand. Kel felt a pit in his stomach as he watched his friend and boss struggle to take a breath and stand up. Come on up. Here we go. Let's get you into the showers and get you all cleaned up. Chewie unsteadily made it to his feet and wobbled down the hall, hugging his chest with both arms. He shivered like a dying animal as he walked. He continued to shake even under the heated shower. 2 droids combed and brushed for an hour, trying to get the vomit out. Kel stepped out to grab Chewie a cup of coffee. A droid brushed just a little too hard on a stubborn fur knot. Chewbacca snarled and smacked the medical droid in the gut, sending it flying through the doorway and into the hall. Kel stepped back in over the busted medical droid, coffee in hand. Chewie still howling. Kel yelled over the racket. All right, take it easy, Chewie. Here, I brought you this, and that's our last Wookiee-sized mug, so for your own sake, don't break the damn thing. Chewie stood there, sopping wet, holding the cup of coffee, feeling layers of self-depreciation settle back into his soul. Soon they were both sitting in the cold, stark lounge, Chewie in his bantha bathrobe, with a 4th cup of coffee sitting on the table just in front of him. Kel leaned over the data screen, packing his pipe. He got the tobacco in the old rustic wooden pipe lit and began typing away on the pad as he puffed away, giving Chewie a chance to have the first word. Chewie just sipped his coffee in silence, head still pounding, bandaged arms peeking out of the robe sleeves when he went to take another sip. It was an uncomfortable amount of time before Chewie broke the silence. Did Oros talk? Did he stash the ship somewhere? Kel responded around the pipe in his mouth without taking his eyes off the data pad. Yes, and yes. There was another awkward silence save the soft sound of Kel's fingers typing on the screen and the uncomfortably loud sipping every time Chewie took a sip. Again, Chewie broke. I take it he was trying to sell the cargo off to the Hutts. He thought we had more time. He didn't realize we were actively tracking him. He thought because the cargo was illicit contraband, being practically given away to a rebel group who wouldn't be around much longer anyways, he'd sell the cargo and tell me he'd made the drop. The crew gave him a hard time making the whole process take longer than it should have. He probably vented the crews and hid the ships, shuttled over to a Fat Line transit, hopped to Hutt space, and the deal was still up in the air when we tracked him down. That about right? Kel slapped the table and jerked an accusatory finger at Chewie. Stang! You criffing bastard! You knew this whole carking time! You probably had the whole thing worked out before we even found Oros. Chewie, do you realize while you were on a self-pity drug binge, I worked on Oros for hours with an Imperial interrogator droid? I carking knew Oros, Chewie, and now he's dead. You already criffing knew. Chewie cut in with an apathetic tone. Yeah, I knew. But Kark Oros, I hope he's dead. He left the Killians on Andorak to die. He double-crossed me, Kel. Kel spit back, pipe in hand now. They are going to die either way. Oros is dead. I made him scream until his heart gave out. The ass fought it with every ounce left in him. Oros was a good man. He tried to make you some extra credits by selling supplies you were flushing down the toilet. Just then, the door chimed and Han walked in. He stood there smirking, one eyebrow raised like Leia used to. Am I interrupting something? Chewie gestured to a chair. Take a seat. Han couldn't ignore Chewie's state. What the hell happened to you? I just don't know what's wrong with my mind, Chewie growled to Han. Something keeps invading it. Some familiar spirit from across the ocean of space, taking my secrets. Some invading force. Han replied like a dimwit. The Sith have returned. Chewie growled in pain. I don't know. The pain. The agony. Chewie slumped down again, tearing at his hair. Maybe it's time we take a trip back to Coruscant and see the family, Han suggested. Deep space, the outer rim, remote moons. None of this is helping our sanity, Chewie. Maybe Luke can do one of those Jedi mind tricks and bring us back to health. All this money and power ain't criffin' worth it if we go mad. The adventures are always going to be out there when we're ready again. Han collapsed as well, and the furry beast and smuggler hugged it out, crying. It'll be good to see Leia and the kids again, Han sobbed. Kel brought them some warm blue milk. Set a course for Coruscant, you swervy skidder, Han told Kel, and launch Oros out the airlock. Enough of that carking Rhodian nerf herder. Kel, a distress signal, Old Imperial. Should we keep on to Coruscant or break away? Han jumped out of the restroom on the Falcon and called on the comms to the bridge. Without the fleet, log the position. We'll send some New Republic scouts to investigate once we get to the capital planet. But Chewie felt himself being led by some force to investigate. Growling, Chewie pushed Kel aside and took the pilot seat, dropping the Falcon out of hyperspace. What the hell? Han swore as he reached the cockpit. The Falcon jolted as a heavy fleet engagement was detected on the sensors only a few light years away. Han shook his head. Punch it, Chewie. Get on the far side of that moon and we'll watch whatever crazy bantha voodoo this is. Imperial criffin' hell. The Falcon boosted away to the far side of an icy moon to spy on the Imperial distress call. The young Mandalorian Tetrax and his grandmother Lix of Tribe T'Solik boarded the old Imperial flagship, named the Void Explorer. The ever-so-large class Star Destroyer floated in the ice-cold ether of space, heavily damaged from ship-to-ship combat. It was an honorable battle, though chaotic and vicious. The Imperial remnants under Moff Cerellian had been thoroughly defeated. As Tetrax and his grandmother Lix walked aboard the Void Explorer, their unique ancestral armor was sealed tight as the gaping holes in the massive Imperial vessel bled out oxygen. Tetrax and Lix's magnetic boots held them firmly to the metallic floor in a cargo bay filled to the brim with loot from innocent planets and the bounty of an empire on the run. Lix smashed open an Imperial cargo crate with her vibro spear. Then, with some effort, the young Tetrax did the same, smashing open the lid of another cargo crate. A litany of arms and armor was revealed. Tetrax's eyes opened wide, behind his Durasteel helmet, at the massive haul of booty. One crate after the other with the latest in old Imperial tech. More advanced, some would say, than this new Republic garbage tech. Dump the stormtrooper armor, haul the weapons on board, overload the hyperdrives of the damaged ships. Keep the good ones, Lix commanded to her lesser Mandalorian supplicants. As you wish. What about the droids? The sister bodyguard of Tribe T'Solik inquired. Lix took a moment to think as melted flaming debris slowly floated around the microgravity environment of the dead Star Destroyer. Crush the droids along with the stormtrooper armor, weapons, high-grade armor, advanced tech, fuel. That's it. Launch the rest into the atmosphere of this gas giant. The sister Mandalorians nodded and hailed the other tribesmen over comms. A countless number of Mandalorian replied, "This is the way." "We are not putting a tracking device on any Mandalorian ships," Kel protested. "Han, get out of the cockpit. Chewie and me got this." The Falcon blasted from behind the icy moon. "There must have been 1,000 Mandalorian on those comms," Kel warned. "Yeah, no Criffin Stang man," Han laughed ominously and worried. "The Falcon's cloaking should hold." Chewie steered the Falcon close to one of the Mandalorian ships sitting there in the debris of the recent space battle with the old Imperial fleet. Giant metal ship hunks, still burning from plasma and laser fire. "Easy there," Han called as Chewie launched a tracking device onto the Mandalorian ship. "Almost there," Chewie growled. Away from most of the debris after dropping the tracking device, the Falcon slowly floated in cloaking. One of the Mandalorian ships suddenly opened fire on the Falcon. "How in the hell?" Han yelled. "Chewie, get us out of here!" A seismic detonator was launched at the Falcon. "No, wait! We're not clear!" Han screamed. Chewie slammed the accelerator, then punched the emergency hyperspace coordinates. The seismic explosion shredded the debris right where the Falcon would have been. But Chewie gambled and flew near instantly into hyperspace to flee the mysterious scene of the Mandalorian space battle with the old Imperial fleet. The Falcon hit a huge chunk of metal debris when jumping into hyperspace and was severely damaged. Kel yelled, "The ship's leaking! Pull us out of hyperspace or she's gonna blow!" "No," Chewie rebuked Kel. "They could be pursuing us." Han butted in. "Gotta at least make it to the inner core. Sending a distress signal to Leia now." The Falcon visibly shook as it maintained a hyperspace trajectory to the solar system of Coruscant. Like a submarine under pressure, the Falcon buckled and squealed, metal screeching, sparks bursting. "No!" Kel screamed as the recreation area of the ship burst into flames and started melting. "The hyperdrive's gonna blow!" Kel yelled. Kel ran to the cockpit and dove onto the hyperdrive release lever. The Falcon tumbled out of hyperspace in a random spin. The three of them were flung around the cockpit as the gravity stabilizer flickered on and off.